So, hi everyone, my name is Aiza. I'm very happy to be here. If I can make a disclaimer that I am a bit jet lagged, so I do have a bit of brain fog. I don't know if it gives me some grace, I don't know. So, today I've been invited to talk about the understanding of Western left's disengagement with Russian imperialism. Actually, the first title I came up with was Implication of the Western left's disengagement with Russian imperialism. But today, this morning, I changed it to Understanding because I felt like understanding is a good place to start. And implications is something that we can discuss together, share our own experiences, and have like a discussion and reflection. So just to walk us through with some of the plan that I have for us today. First, I'm going to start with kind of like the goal of what I'm doing here, and then I'm going to follow up with the question of my own positionality, which I think is important to address, followed by some crucial context. I'm sure like most of us here know a lot of information and have a lot of knowledge, but just in case there is a need for like more background context, I have it. And then I want to talk about specifically the fact of weaponization of indigenous bodies during the war, the violence of erasure, both in Russian national context and in the West, and then talk specifically about the Western left in the war, their reaction, their interventions, and understanding all of that. And finally, I'm going to close with the ground for solidarity building, why it's important, and what are some of the, I guess, reasons for it that we can use. So the mission and the goal, I'm following the rhetoric that has been kind of like propagated by black feminism, which is calling people in. So as you know, there is such a thing as calling people out, which is when what we do is kind of intervene in other people's discourses and knowledge and try to maybe show them that they're wrong. But what often ends up happening is that people get alienated by showing that there's maybe some faults in their thinking. And instead of that, calling people in invites them to reflect on their own certain maybe privileges, their own the stereotypes that they learned, and not to use that to drag them further away, but actually to invite them in and to invite them for a discussion and maybe to build more grounds for solidarity. And here we're trying to highlight the need for fostering transnational solidarity with the colonial movements against Russian settler state, and to disrupt the myopic narratives that we're seeing in Western media about Russian imperialism. And also I'm going to sit down, it's okay. Okay. So some of the key arguments I came up with, this is a topic that's actually, I would say, is still relatively under-researched and under-published, so there's not a lot to necessarily rely on. But what I found is that Russia's positionality that has been propagated during the Soviet Union and now by Putin as this like enemy and antithesis to mainstream Western modernity makes it an attractive party to root for some Western leftists who base their identity on disillusionment with Western civilization. So if they position themselves as against Western modernity, for some of them it seems like the only logical way is to support the enemies of the West, which how Putin positions itself. When it comes to specifically the project of nationalism and national identity within Russia, I argue that by constructing a specific national identity that is driven by Slavic Russian culture, language, and ethnicity, Putin's government sets up indigenous groups as the other that can be persecuted for their deviation from this Slavic-driven national identity. And this marginalization basically contributes to the obscurement and marginalization of indigenous communities in the Russian national discourse, not only in the general Western or global discourses, and also in the general quote-unquote post-Soviet discussions. And many Russians and non-indigenous groups that are within Russia adopt certain opinions and beliefs based on this rhetoric about indigenous communities that are rooted in coloniality and racism. So there is an active process where indigenous communities are being alienated not only globally, but specifically within Russian settler state. And because of that, a lot of the times outsiders of the indigenous communities have the capacity to perpetuate this obscurement and ignorant opinions among outsiders in the media. And so the cycle of ignorance kind of continues. And also here I want to point out that this talk today is specifically focused on indigenous communities of Russia. We're talking about North Asians, Siberians, Tatars, Buryats, Kalmykia, Tuva and others. So because I wanted to focus on that specifically because I feel like the discourse about this has been relatively marginalized in the media and even when it comes to interventions of the Western left. So I think it's important to acknowledge where I'm coming from and what kind of perspective I'm bringing. I certainly do not claim to have a claim for objective truths. I am from Kazakhstan, I'm from Central Asia, and it comes with a certain amount of privileges. Kazakhstan is the largest country in Central Asia. It dominates a lot of discourses in Central Asia. And also it's of paramount interest to Russia. It's of paramount interest to the US and the West because of natural resources. So it gives people like me a lot of visibility and a lot of privileges. I currently live in the US, so I deal with West and Western leftists a lot. But I am the type of person that is like partaking in colonial institutions of American universities, and I am someone who is accepted in those institutions, and I speak English, I speak in English to them, so it gives me a lot of insight, but also a lot of certain, treatment, like a better treatment that it comes for like indigenous communities. The reason I was invited here, I believe, is that last year in February I published an opinion essay that was titled "Why Romanticizing the Soviet Union Obscures its Colonial Past." Interestingly and sadly enough, I did not think about this essay because of the escalation of the war in Ukraine. The idea was born because of TikTok, because I actually saw a lot of, like in August 2021, I have been seeing a lot of trends on social media, specifically on TikTok, where Western leftists would turn on the Soviet Union's anthem and they would like hang Soviet Union flags on their walls and kind of like film like these videos where they kind of pledge allegiance to the Soviet Union and as a way to like shaping their own leftist identity, which irked me to no end. And this is why I wrote this, and then by the time it was accepted and edited, it actually came out 4 days after Russia escalated its invasion of Ukraine. So the review of the context, so some of the facts I think that it's important to bring with us. I put this here because this is an interesting example of like, I don't know if anyone knows this person, but he used to work for Vox Media, which is a leftist liberal media based in the US that is very popular among like liberals and leftists. And he published this video 2 years ago, so way before this context, asking why is Russia so damn big? And the short answer to this is colonialism, which if you've seen this video like I have, he does not talk about at all. He paints a picture of like Russia as a benevolent state that is multicultural, multi-ethnic, where indigenous groups have been willingly joining Russia, and they have been treated so kindly and so well, and the multiculturalism of Russia is like a good thing, something to look up to Russia, which I think a good example of a very violent narrative that we're trying to address here today. So some of the facts that maybe are useful is that currently Russia has 46 indigenous groups that are officially, registered. They are called by the Russian government as the small nations of North Siberia and the Far East. You can already see the language that's coded in here, the small nations. So these are insignificant groups that are part of a larger, greater Russian nation. They amount to 0.2% of the total Russian population, but it's no less than 300,000 people, actually. And they live in autonomies that are larger than some of the European nations. So it's a considerable amount of land, of people, and of their own tradition and cultures. Those nations in the Soviet Union, there was a creation of a forced class-based social system that worked to hide and destroy indigenous identity. It's definitely not unique to the Soviet Union. We see it in the US, we see it in Canada, Australia, wherever there is a presence of indigenous communities. There was always efforts to erase differences and assimilate into European and like modern, Western modernity structures of race, gender, and class. So we're not just talking about some like shallow things as like national identity. We're talking about how gender roles dynamics within families, the positionality within class, how indigenous people are locked into specific positions that are usually very subservient and inferior within the nation. And of course, all of this comes with a lot of violent processes that include purges, deportations, and in general, there was extermination of, for example, in the 20th century, of indigenous intelligentsia during Stalinism, which also happened in Central Asia. And it leads to the increasing erasure of languages and cultural and decolonial leadership. Currently today, Putin's government is doing the policy of centralization, which means that the power of self-determination, the power of governance is very tightly located in the Kremlin, and Putin and his government, they have the power to decide who rules those autonomous regions, who represents them, and what kind of policies do they enact. Today, that's I guess a reactive statement, but when the war broke out in February, I had a professor at my department of sociology at Rutgers, who is this a decolonial professor from Morocco, and she seemed very disinterested in the conflict. And one thing that she told me is that she's not interested in the war of white people, which I found to be quite ignorant statement, because a lot of people don't necessarily know that it's not a war of white people, and just like it happens among other empires, there is a continuous weaponization of indigenous bodies during the war. So the military service in Russia is a tax on the poor, since those with connections and means, those who are in urban centers, are able to more easily avoid conscription and more easily avoid mobilization. But for example, in such regions as Buryatia and Dagestan, joining the army becomes a relatively secure way to earn a living. So all of this comes as a result of years and years of colonial domination, where such indigenous regions are poorer, they have less career opportunities, they also have less social standing and cultural capital, and joining the army is always often constructed as a way out of it, which they can do it voluntarily, but it doesn't mean that it's not a reaction to years of colonialism and imperial rule. Soldiers from these regions are dying in higher numbers than any other ethnic groups in Ukraine, than any other population from urban capitals. And it's not only from the last year that ethnic minorities have been visible presence fighting in Ukraine for Russian army. For example, since 2014, non-Slavic soldiers have earned their reputation in Ukraine as quote-unquote Donbas Indians and Putin's fighting Buryats, which once again, it's an example of how solidarities are fractured, because it's hard to blame Ukrainians when they're seeing people who come to their land, who exterminate their people, who produce so much violence, and they see certain type of soldiers, and it once again perpetuates the divisions among the subject of Russian imperialism. It also been going on during the 20th century, during the Second World War, when the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan. They actually specifically recruited North Asian and Central Asians because they were hoping that the cultural ties, maybe some religious ties, would help Soviet Union in Afghanistan. But reportedly what ended up happening actually is that, for example, Central Asian soldiers, they bonded with Afghan people more because they had more in common. So all of this represents a continuation of constructing indigenous lives as disposable and as basically a resource for the state that targets their precarious socioeconomic position within the country. And once again, I also want to point out that it's not something that Russia came up with or invented. We can see it, for example, in the US. People who are mostly targeted for joining the army are Black, Hispanic, they're mostly lower class and working class. So in general, marginalized populations have always been the target of such weaponization. Here I have an old Soviet propaganda poster that kind of positions as an indigenous person with no specific detail. His name is Samet, and he dies for the quote-unquote motherland, and it's a good thing, and it's something that is basically necessary. And here I have screenshots that people have taken of advertisement of joining the army, which promises a certain salary, which like from it looks like it's a good salary. It's salaries that are often unavailable to a lot of indigenous groups, which once again makes joining the army a more lucrative option despite the cost that it entails. So now I want to talk about, like, through all of this context, we can see how all of this constitutes like a violence of erasure, where indigenous groups are erased from the public external Russian national identity, and also within like internal debates about who is a Russian person and like what is their culture, etc. And I also want to point out that when we look at the example of violence against indigenous communities in Russia, when we look at Russian colonialism that is still going on in the Russian Federation, it's an example why we cannot just quote unquote stop the war, like the discourse that has been dominating a lot of Western leftists, or in general like Western circles, because just even if, as some people suggested, that Ukraine just tries to negotiate with the aggressor to stop all of this, it won't stop Russian imperialism within Russian Federation. It won't stop the violence that is being perpetrated against indigenous communities. Some of the examples that I'm talking about is how deportation and dislocation of ethnic communities has been used as an imperial tool of erasure that eradicates important roots between indigenous groups and their land. And the land becomes a resource for the state to affirm its capacity for homogenization. And deportation is not only about the land, it's also about destabilization of cultural and linguistic capacities of ethnic groups. And this way, religious and cultural differences are extremely important for Russian imperialism, which is why indigenous practices and ties to their cultural identities are framed as a threat to Russian modernizing projects and Russian like homogenizing national identity building project. But whenever Russia is being lauded for its multiculturalism, as I talked about in that YouTube video, it's very important to remember that it's like Russian wins. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, so whenever we talk about the multiculturalism, representation, federalism in Russia, it's important to remember that it did not come as a gift from Russian government. All of these are hard-won victories of indigenous resistance and organizing. Whenever marginalized people, marginalized communities gain some sort of wins, they always gain them through struggle, often through violence, and it's a necessary step that they have to undertake. And even if the war magically stops and Russia like leaves Ukraine, etc., the violence that has been perpetuated remains within Russian Federation. So now let's turn to Western left and their reaction to the war. This is a screenshot I took from Noam Chomsky, who is this like very, I would say, lauded and very like lionized Western intellectual. He's very popular among leftist communities, and he's been speaking out a lot about Russia and the war, etc. He uses this rhetoric that is very Western-centric and very US-centric, where basically he's talking about how Russia is simply reacting to the NATO expansion, and that if the US didn't do all of the like also atrocious imperial things that it does, then all of this wouldn't happen. So some of the things, NATO, the discourse about NATO is one of the examples of the things that Western left tends to focus on. So we have this idea that Russia is naturally and understandably threatened by NATO's expansion. That is something that the US did on purpose. I personally cannot comment on that because I do not know like what the US government like intends to do or doesn't intend to do. Then there's also the discourse about how Western leftists, they really want the idea of a multipolar world. So they like the idea of the US being not only the only superpower in the world. They think it helps to balance it out, and they do not think that if the US is allowed basically to pursue its imperial quests and it's allowed to establish its cultural power, military power, then Russia should be allowed to do the same. Or For example, they also saying that Russia is playing by American rules and just doing the same what the US does, which once again disregards the history of what Russia has been doing separately for centuries, separately from the US. Then there is also the idea of sticking it to Western colonizers, basically the idea that Russia is kind of like an anti-hero that is necessary to check Western empires. And there's also the idea of pacifism, which is that violence is never the answer, and that no matter what, we should just cease all violence and then figure it out from there, which also disregards the idea that decolonization itself is a very violent process. Freedom of colonial nations have been hard-won. For example, in Africa, Latin America, it was never truly granted. I think Central Asia is an interesting example where it was a less violent of a situation, but which led to very violent authoritarianism that we have currently in Central Asia. So the reactions that we have seen from the Western left. As Russia is escalating its military occupation and invasion of Ukraine, reaction in the Western audience have become more heterogeneous. So I would not say that we can say that Western left thinks this one thing. Of course, it's impossible to generalize, and there's so many different groups. So I'm talking in more specific terms of I guess what we have been seeing and what have been specifically worrying activists and people in indigenous groups in Central Asia, etc. Also, Western like Noam Chomsky, Western politicians, scholars, and public figures have been very active in those discourses. They have been coming out and kind of trying to influence public thoughts. There is the whole realist approach coming from international relations and politics that prioritizes the end of conflict and questions the idea and possibility of Ukraine's victory. So the discourses that it's very idealistic to seek victory of Ukraine, and what Ukraine needs to do is that it just needs to negotiate, it needs to find some sort of middle ground, some sort of compromise with Russia, and then go from there. Interestingly, there have been some articles published that the far right and the far left in the US seem to align on many viewpoints in regards to Russia and the West's involvement. So they specifically talk about how the US has the power to basically dictate the conditions under which the war should be resolved, and that the policies of lending weapons, lending military aid are heavily dependent on what the US wants, what it thinks, and what would benefit the US and West the most. So in this case, there has been a tendency among the Western left to kind of focus specifically on state interests and state actors, and disregard the idea that states are itself quite colonial and violent institutions, and they also are comprised of many various communities and groups. I have a quote here from Leila Al-Shami article that she shared a few years ago. She wrote it specifically in reference to the war in Syria and the conflict between the Western left and its reaction to Russia's involvement in Syria. And her argument goes that solidarity is therefore extended to states, seen as the main actor in a struggle for liberation, rather than the oppressed and underprivileged groups in any given society, no matter what the state of the tyranny is. And we're seeing that the Western left are treating, despite the fact that they are claim to be critical, or they are critical of Western modernity and Western imperialism, they tend to perpetuate the same power hierarchies by treating the United States as de facto global power, even though it is the great power that they oppose. They inadvertently repeat the great power tropes, such as that the US should and can achieve ceasefire in Ukraine and dictate the terms of that ceasefire to both Russia and Ukraine, which includes the idea either that the US should convince Ukraine to cede territory and the people who live there to Russia. And then, so we have those reactions, and after reactions follow interventions. Interventions have been coming from many different sides, from many different positions. There's currently an active production of knowledge that's taking place, specifically after last year, but also earlier, calling out Western leftists and in their ambiguity and or support of Russia. And these efforts are aimed at intervening in Western positionality towards Russia in the war. The main objectives that we're seeing in these interventions include a lack of knowledge on Russian imperialism, perceiving Russia as a simple antithesis to the West, also perceiving Russia as this like homogeneous, monotonous, like one actor, and romanticizing Soviet socialism. I want to point out that interventions for Western leftism have been dominated by Eastern Europeans, Ukrainians, and Central Asians. In my opinion, we have not seen enough coming from indigenous groups of Russia. There have been a lack of platform, I would say, in those spaces. And I think it's a good point for us to think how we can help to bring this platform to those groups and amplify their voices. So a bit of a long slide, but it's one of the last ones. So when we try to comprehend the Western left and the war, there are many things to consider. The first one is that, in general, we could say that the left have, like, no matter where it is, Western, non-Western, has had a curse of being more heterogeneous in their visions. So if we have the right conservative traditionalist movements, they usually have a more coherent idea of what's the vision that they are following and what they're trying to build. So traditionalism and conservatism is usually like a more outlined idea of like, what do we want? We want specific gender hierarchy, we want specific ideas of white supremacy, we want specific vision of capitalism. So all of it is kind of easier to agree on for the other side of the spectrum. Whereas when it comes to the left and the progressives, the idea of what the alternative should be are endless. And it's natural that it's very hard to consolidate these priorities and ideas into one dominant view that could be disseminated among the left in the West and outside of the West. Then we have a huge problem of Western centrism, where the ideas of what help in Ukraine basically entails for Western countries, how does it challenge or affirm Western imperialism, and this view only sees and recognizes the horrors of Western imperialism, and it places support for Ukraine and critique of Russia within the power dynamics of Western politics specifically. Then also there is a lot of the populist narrative that the Western left tends to focus on the idea even like of the people versus the elites. So if some people, like if some Westerners, they look at the state as an actor and they tend to focus too much on states, then there are also people who focus on the people. So, and they specifically are trying to position themselves against the elites, no matter where they come from, like Russian elites, American elites. However, this view of the people, because Russia has positioned itself as such a homogeneous identity, and because it has limited knowledge of the Russian imperialism within the nation, and it has projected the view that Russia is dominated by Slavic culture, Slavic languages, Slavic ethnicities. Because of that, when Western leftists turn to the idea of the people, this idea ends up being still dominated by Slavic Russian culture, and it contributes to their limited knowledge of what Russian identity is and what social hierarchies it upholds. And it's because Russia has succeeded in erasing indigenous groups from its external national identity, which prevents outsiders from comprehending the violence of indigenous assimilation. And many people buy into Russia's image of one nation guided by an overarching nationalism, and treat Russia as like this one entity, whether they want to support it or critique it. And finally, I want to point out how we can maybe build grounds for solidarity. It involves a lot of work. I know for myself it has been hard to unlearn a lot of things, and also to come to terms with the idea that resistance and insurgents, it does come with a certain amount of violence, it does come with a certain amount of organizing and mobilizing. Some of the ideas that we can think is that personally it comes from a lot of self-education and unlearning the status quo, so untangling the idea that orientation towards nation states and conceiving of liberation as a project of statehood and modernity, and resisting this repeating great power tropes and centering Western interests. It's also important to compare experiences because, for example, right now, whenever I talk to people in the US, very few of them know that indigenous people in Russia even exist, and very few of them know that those indigenous groups are actually basically have been genetically linked to indigenous groups in North America. So they have common ancestry, and they have common experience with settler state violence. And because those methods of forced indigenous assimilation that have been precipitated by overarching nationalism, they have taken place throughout the world, so they can be found in US, Canada, Australia. And I think it's a useful thing to point out to a lot of Westerners that they can learn those things, and they can also learn from those groups, because just because they are outside of the West does not mean that they do not suffer from the same type of violence and assimilation. And finally, there have been a lot of efforts in insurgents from indigenous groups in Russia that have been organizing and engaging. They have been organizing and engaging way before last year, and they have been found across various communities. They have different methods and different aims. And also I want to point out that they do not necessarily stand, some like indigenous groups in Russia, they don't necessarily stand against, Western modernity. They engage with it in many different ways. Some groups, they actually use the idea of maybe Western alliances, resources for empowerment, because they have to get those like from somewhere. So we're not necessarily asking or like expecting those groups to be entirely, I don't know, like anti-modernity or disengaged with the West entirely. Instead, they actually have been building certain networks, and they have been using those things to their advantage. And also, it's important to point out that all of these insurgencies are very gendered. Like everything. And women, for example, in Buryatia, they have been specifically using their role of like cultural transmitters to reject Russian imperialism, to transmit ideas of resistance, and to build certain identities. They pass down the culture, they try to pass down the language, and all of it is involved in hard labor, specifically of women, and the role that they have been assigned in ethnic and national group building. And the final thought I have is that I want to come back to the idea of modernity and the idea that Russia has positioned itself. I don't know if any of you have watched Putin's address for the New Year's. I haven't seen all of it. It's very long and very hard to watch. But naturally, yeah. But he was talking there a lot about Western empires and Western modernity, and basically positioning Russia as an underdog. And I think Madina Tlostanova has a very good term for this, which she calls subaltern empires. And Russia is an example of a subaltern empire, where it positions itself as have been basically marginalized by the West, and experiencing violence and some sort of stigmatization by the West. And when they engage in violence, they say that it's against Western modernity. However, we don't need the idea of one modernity. I would argue it's not that simple to say that, Russia does not partake in this idea of civilizing nations, of civilizing non-white groups that have been precipitated by the British Empire, the Dutch Empire, the US today. But even if it does not engage in it, does not mean that Russia does not have its own project of modernity that is widely different, but it's still in conversation with Western modernity, and it might be subaltern in relation to the West, and it complicates our discourse of modernity and civilization from like a linear continuum where the West is here, Russia is here, everyone else maybe is here. Instead, it's like, I would argue, a much more complex situation. It does not mean that Russia does not deploy the discourse of modernity to mark its imperial difference, but it means that there must be a space for additional and more nuanced categories which account for the secondary place of Russia in modernity discourse as a force that possibly drives supporters for Russia positions and encourages them to disregard Orientalization and racialization of its colonies and indigenous groups. And here, I have it as an empty slide because I was hoping that we can come up with some sort of maybe, I don't know, tips and examples of what we can take away from this, of maybe how can we engage with people who speak about the war and Russian imperialism from the Western leftist perspective. So I have it open here, so maybe if we want to write something down together, we can do it. But with that, I think I'm going to turn this over to a discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, and it's an invitation to comment, so you can also ask questions to what was presented, but you can also just have some thoughts on the topic. And I don't know if we necessarily need a microphone, but you can have it if you want, because it's better for the recording, which we can publish later, but also if you don't want to be on the recording, you can just speak without the microphone, then we will not hear it.
Yeah, I was also hoping to maybe hear any of your own experiences with dealing with Western leftism and maybe how you reacted to it. I also wanted to tell I'm going to start by telling my own very frustrating experience I've had. So I've taken a graduate class at the New School in New York, and there was this professor called Ann Stoller. I don't know if any of you know her. She's kind of this very well-known professor of colonialism. She studied colonialism, as she says, for 40 years, and she's very well-known anyway. So one time I came to class and I heard her talking to, she is a white woman, in case you don't know, and she was talking to two of her students who were also white American men, and they were all engaging in a discussion where they were saying that decolonization is completely empty. They were saying decolonization is a buzzword, it's a placeholder, and people who talk about decolonization don't know what they're talking about, and instead they should just like read some books on colonization or whatever. And I found it extremely frustrating to be entering this space that's dominated by white Americans who completely look down on the idea of decolonization, and they kind of want to affirm their own idea that expertise and knowledge is needed in order to talk about decolonization, which I think is entirely untrue, because the concept of decolonization fully depends on the idea that people should partake in it, and they should take away from the power of who defines what it is and what are the legitimate ways to fight for liberation. So this is my example. If you all have any, I would love to listen.
Is there a comment already? Any question?
I can maybe just add a sort of reflection on, and this is also academia, because I've been very frustrated with the German context, going to various conferences, and only recently they actually started mostly Ukrainian organized conferences that finally centered Ukrainian voices on the invasion of Ukraine, and not some mansplaining German stuff that completely speaks over Ukrainian voices and shows absolute dire lack of knowledge of any of them, or absolute lack of engagement with them, such as, for example, German philosopher Jürgen Habermas.
Oh.
I am in philosophy, so
yeah.
I cited him in the past, and I'm done. And I went to these sort of conferences, and what I see as a pattern are German professors always standing up and saying some completely kind of narcissistic statements about how they absolutely do not understand why Putin's war, blah blah, is so crazy and irrational, and like what's going on, and we all have to like listen to their long whatever monologues manifesting this kind of talk, which shows a very dire lack of understanding of like what imperialism and colonialism does. Also from people who claim to know that they've done a lot of work on Nazism and German colonialism. I find it absolutely striking, and as I was watching it over some time, it just like occurred to me that it's basically the stories that Germans want to talk and say about their ancestors, because it's basically about an innocent, unknowing Russian society that is being manipulated by some crazy leader and doesn't know the implications of their own actions, and that I find really troubling. And it shows us how German society and academia actually hasn't done the work of dealing with its own colonial and Nazi past, and its sort of ongoing implications, also ongoing implications in how those discussions are silencing the voices of those who are actually now being subjected to Russian Nazism and colonialism.
Yeah. Thank you, Teresa, also for starting the discussion. Yeah, I agree. I do not know like all the in and outs of the debates that are going on in Germany right now. I hear things, I read things, also thanks to you. But I know that it's extremely hard to not feel like it's personal attack when people say, oh, like Russian imperialism, or there has been a lot of violence perpetrated against indigenous nations. And I think this is why I put the calling in thing as the mission of my lecture, because I saw that even if you particularly as, I don't know, a citizen of Russia or as a resident of like Moscow or St. Petersburg, you are not personally perpetrating any violence against those groups, or you're not personally responsible, of course, for starting like Russian imperialism. I think it's important to still use, like whatever your positionality is, it comes with certain amount of privileges and also possibly with certain amount of resources that we can use to at least amplify their voices, or at least correct someone when they say something. And just most importantly, I think what I found for myself is that engaging in your own education, and just always think that there is someone probably who knows something on this topic more than you that you should listen to. So I understand that it's hard to think of, like as a group, like for Russians as it is maybe like for Germans to think of themselves as like, oh, like we are all personally responsible, like, but maybe sometimes we are. Maybe sometimes we need to engage more, or maybe not to look away in certain things. So yeah, thank you.
There's a comment up.
Sorry, you can write on comments. It's fine. Okay.
Is it on? Yeah, it's fine. It doesn't have to amplify a lot, but we are recording through like a device which is connected to them.
Fine. I'd like to hear how your conversation with your professor you mentioned first continued. The professor who said she's not interested in a white award, because this resembles a lot with my experiences of the last years, that there is a lot of lack of knowledge around that and a lot of anger. And how do you also see the possibility to connect fights there? And another experience I have a lot with Germans here in connection to communism is that often it's claimed that I'm too involved, like as a person who has, like say, as a family who has survived Stalinism and stuff. It's like, but this wasn't a real communism, and yeah, and I'm too involved. So that's also very interesting if you talk about knowledge and who was able to speak and who's taken seriously, that even if you have language and if you have words, I mean, that's a very classic thing, that emotions are already disregarded.
Yeah, actually, so after for another professor who told me it's a war of white people, she then promptly asked me, when in February when the whole thing went down, I emailed her and I told her that I'm not going to be coming into class because, I've been feeling quite unwell. And she just called me and she was like, you should write a paper on it right now. Or she was like, I have a class next week, you should come in and talk about it. So she asked me to do actually like a lot of labor when I was processing a lot of like emotions. But after she said the thing about white people, I actually understood that I need to come to her class. So I took over her class for one period, which was for like bachelor students at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And I came in and I basically like explain them in detail that it's not a war of white people and why it's important and why they should know about it, what are the dynamics, why it is Russian imperialism, why we should stand with Ukraine, why should we should also stand with communities within Russia who are suffering from Russian imperialism. So I thought that like at least I did my part by like entering the space and doing like a small lecture for those students. But when it came to Ann Stoller, it was actually way more complicated because after I overheard that, the class started shortly after, so I didn't engage in the discussion at the moment. And then I actually ended up just like sitting in class and arguing with her in my head. So the entire class, I was just like thinking of arguments and what I would say. But then I ended up like just like not like being too scared because she's so well known, and she holds, at that point she held so much power over me as my professor and as someone who is so influential in the academic field. But interestingly enough, she emailed me that night asking me why my face was so upsetting during the class, which turns out that she was looking at me a lot during the class, and she did not like that I did not look happy in the class. And it felt to me like, yeah, like once again, like emotions, like, oh, like why aren't you like more happy or engaged or whatever? So I think it's a good example of how when we are frustrated, when we get angry for good reasons, we always are like called out on being irrational, emotional, hysterical. But at the same time, when it comes to these ideas, I spoke up in later classes, and I said like, oh, like people don't need to read books to be decolonial. Like this, like isn't the whole idea of like not like doing it by colonial institutions of academia and stuff like that. And she very easily dismissed me. And I would say, one of the 3 students of color in the class of 15 people, and one of the 2 who looked visibly unwhite. So I never gained any like support within the class, but I did end up going to people like afterwards and like talking to them and being like, don't you think we shouldn't agree with her? Like, don't you think it's this and that? Don't you think it's like quite like violent or wrong for her to say it? And a lot of people agreed with me outside of the class when she was not present, when she was not listening. So that's the tactic I found, is that taking it away from the power dominion of this person. I maybe could not change her mind because, well, she thinks like we are in different stages in academic and like knowledge, learning stages. So, but I try to disseminate certain ideas within the class anyway. Also, fun fact, she bragged a lot about being friends with Noam Chomsky, which I was like, just read the room. No, not right now. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Oksana. I'm a Ukrainian feminist activist, now also aspiring scholar. And thank you for doing this work of structuring a lot of experiences that I have also gone through. I don't myself have sometimes energy for all of this labor, but I lived through a lot, and I also can relate to your challenge of like having to produce knowledge under pressure when you are doing a lot of emotional work at the same time. For me, like I have been able to produce over the last year a poem that resonated surprisingly a lot more than maybe an academic article by me would have resonated, and it's called The Letter to Western Feminists, and it's about specifically my experience of talking to the feminist community, the anti-militarist, feminist pacifist community from the West, which has a lot of similar arguments, but it also adds to this, adds the argument of it's NATO's war and you know, it's nuclear powers fighting and all of this, which also is kind of difficult to counter because part of it is true. But when I was listening to your lecture, I had a couple of thoughts, and I wanted to share them with you and ask you. You say that, first of all, you talk about like the right and the left. To me, this is like also a bit homogeneous because there's also the liberal in the middle,
Yeah.
which I don't always know where to place them. But I'm wondering whether you think about which discourse, like the liberals, find themselves in, or are they dispersed? And I think about this because when you spoke about the way Russia is perceived as this homogeneous Slavic white nation, I think this is also the way we perceive the West. And the voices we hear from the West are actually mostly coming from privileged white academic. So I think for us, maybe this is like a thinking coming from just right now. We also need to be more granular in how we see the West and whose voices we actually want to reach out and amplify. Thinking of the US as a separate colonial state, I'm wondering if you, being there, have heard different positions or different voices coming out from indigenous communities about connections between experiences of colonization, of settler colonialism, and therefore more kind of logical solidarity. And my other reflection is in the fact that when I try to, this main argument about this is not a war, of Russia and US, it's also a war for decolonization of Ukraine and other nations, we sort of dismiss the fact that part of it is true. US is a freaking empire that has done a lot of wrong and continues to do that. And for me, like elaborating a decolonial solidarity means not relying blindly on the support of the power that is continuing to do wrong. And I'm still working out that kind of position and what that means. Because yes, we rely on weapons from the US and on their political will, and we look forward to the elections and whatnot. It's a weird place to be, like, to understand how much you depend on such a huge power. But I don't know if you have thought about this complexity as well. Or, we as Ukrainians think about it a lot, but maybe we can think together about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All very great reflections, and all are very necessary. I think it's very hard to give a lecture, period, but also give a lecture and make sure that you are as detailed, as precise as the topic warrants itself, because it is extremely difficult and it's extremely nuanced, and there are so many groups involved and so many high stakes. I would say the reason I focused on Western left is that I think maybe because before it all started, or in general when I was personally going through my own radicalization and going through my own adaptation of leftist views, progressive views, I always expected to be more understood and accepted by the left than by the liberals. And when I found that most of them don't know about Central Asia, or even if I tell them, they don't necessarily care about Central Asia, they don't perceive Central Asia as a post-colonial community, I found it more heartbreaking than when liberals don't know, or more conservative people don't know. So I think there's specific type of heartbreak involved when people who are positioning themselves on the similar, spectrum, or claim to have similar views to you, they kind of disregard you in this term. I would say that liberals are probably somewhere in the middle of all of this, or they also engage in all of this as kind of a complex matter where they don't necessarily know a lot about it. I would say the fact that the US, for example, maybe the West in general, it has such a strong cultural pull, it has such an intense economic force. What I found living there is that people may know a lot of things about what's happening on our side of the world, but they're not necessarily as engaged with it. And what I've heard from people tell me, who are Western leftists or organizers, is that they have too much going on over there. They say we're fighting too much with our own racism, with our own police brutality, homelessness, etc. So sometimes they claim that there's just not enough space necessarily to engage with questions outside of it. And it's so easy for them to just be in their own world, because first of all, when it comes to the US, it's removed by an ocean. So it almost feels like it's not like real, whatever's outside. And also because they produce most of the culture that is like American-centered, they don't necessarily feel like it's maybe like necessary to get the type of education. So I think that's a general like alarming tendency that I've been seeing in organizers and communities over there. That does not mean that they would not support us if they knew more, or that they don't have empathy, that they don't have informed views. Is that maybe like it's also hard not to burn out as an organizer, as an activist, as anyone who reads the news, really. So I understand why they may not feel like they have more to extend, which is why I think it's necessary to bring those discussions to larger levels and call for this solidarity and say, well, you burned out from this, we also have this, and maybe we can all like talk about this together. I would say that I definitely stand in solidarity and I feel for all those communities. It's very disheartening to see like the level of homelessness and brutality, for example, in New York. But the one thing that does not change, despite the fact, like the state of things over there, is that they do not feel necessarily encouraged to look outside of the West. And I think this is the part that we can engage with them more, not necessarily discarding their own struggles and their own, I don't know, ideas of liberation, but just like engaging with them more. And also, I think there was always a tendency by American academics, specifically American academics of color, Black American academics, or like writers such as like James Baldwin, even like Malcolm X, Angela Davis, to kind of paint Soviet Union as a good thing. Because if they experienced it, if they were invited, if they traveled to it, they always said that it's a very different thing because they weren't treated with the same racism that they were treated in the States, which could, well, like, it might be true, like it certainly is like their own experience of it, and when they come and they say, oh, like it's different, it's not like American racism, and yeah, like it's not, but it does not mean that like violence does not go on in maybe different places or in different ways. And I think a lot of the times Western leftists or progressives, when they don't see what they see in the West, they might necessarily assume that it means that the problems are not on the same extent, or maybe that they don't have the same urgency. Or maybe because they don't see as many people marching or as many people showing up on the streets, because, well, it's very difficult to do, at least like where I'm come from. And that's why they think, oh, like, then it means it's different, or maybe it's not warrants as much attention from us. So I think all of that, I agree with you, is incredibly complex and definitely something that we can all like think about, and not necessarily entirely reject Western leftists or like liberals or whoever wants to engage with us, but to maybe inform them more about it. And the last part about how we also engage with the West in terms of like aid and in terms of like protection and security, I absolutely agree with you that it's impossible to just reject the state of the world entirely and say, oh, like I reject modernity and I'm just not going to engage with Russian imperialism, but also with Western imperialism, because it's hard to deny the truth that, for example, like in Kazakhstan, a lot of like feminist organizers, a lot of organizers against the state, they do need Western money. Western money comes like when local like governments do not offer that support. Advocacy in the West helps a lot. You have to write to Amnesty International. You have to get the Human Rights Watch involved. All of those institutions may be problematic, but you cannot deny that we live in a world where they have power. They have more capital than we do, so we need to engage with them. We cannot alienate them. We cannot like openly hate on them. We have to play the game, basically. And I don't think it necessarily means that we are less sincere in our own critique of the West, or we're less engaged in our own like struggle or recognizing Russian imperialism. It's just, I don't know, it's just part of the reality. And for example, I was reading, like it was a study from 2004 about insurgencies in Buryatia, and they were saying how those groups were specifically engaging with the West a lot. they were like gravitating towards Western modernity more than Russian imperialism, and it just felt like something of a resource to them. It felt something that they wanted to do, something that would help them. And who are we, or who am I to deny them that? Who am I to say, no, like if you want to be a true leftist or if you want to be a true advocate, you have to like do it this and that. I think when resources are available, we have to like get the chance to use them. Hopefully, at some point we can dictate our own terms, and like maybe we can use them to amplify certain arguments. But basically, in order to stand against something, we do need to engage with certain parties, maybe even if we don't agree with their own like nature. Thank you, though. Thank you so much.
I wasn't sure if you mentioned this about the indigenous voices inside the Western left. Have you been able to see or identify any positions coming from groups that have experienced colonialism, like inside the US or inside, like in Canada, for example? I mean, that's just because we're in your base right now, but like seeing those voices as part of or different from the general Western left discourse.
You mean their opinions on the
Any
thing?
public positions, like you said, like in, for example, inside Russia, there have been a lot of indigenous communities kind of starting to speak out or producing knowledge. I haven't heard or seen much coming from the West. What we see mostly is these white kind of intellectuals, academics, liberals or leftists, but coming from the positionality of not reflecting their own set of colonialism. And I don't know if it's kind of like showing the mirror back to the same.
I would say that there's definitely a lot going on, and it's becoming a more like, I don't want to like overestimate it, but it's becoming a bit more public and maybe it's in certain ways mainstream to acknowledge indigenous nations in the US and to kind of focus on them when it comes to telling history. Like if you go to a museum, a lot of the times a museum would have an acknowledgement of the land. They would say we are currently, like New York is located on a Lenape land of indigenous groups, so they do land acknowledgements. At Rutgers, certain professors also do land acknowledgement, and they try to invite scholars. Those people are still, so it's a different situation because indigenous groups mostly live in reservations, and when they live in reservations, they have very different social and economic conditions, so they are like segregated and their voices are definitely less heard because of that. But there have been a lot of like publishers, a lot of also like conferences, something like this, where they invite them and they make them more visible. I would say that in general, it is kind of a similar state of things where maybe Americans, like an average American, won't think about it as much. They won't engage with it. They don't think of the land that they're on as a stolen land. But in more like, I don't know, like liberal or in states that are coded as democratic, between like Democrat and Republican partisan thing in the US, those places, they engage with it more and they try to bring it out more. And it's very, in some ways, it is gratifying to go to like a museum and see that most of it will be centered around the fact that this is stolen land. Those are indigenous groups and this is how it was all developed. It was interesting to, I went to a Museum of New York recently, and American Museum of Natural History. And they have this like display that shows the meeting between settlers and indigenous groups, and it's like depicted as a meeting that's like very friendly, almost like shaking hands and everything. It's very old. It has been there since like 20th century, and they installed a plaque under it saying, oh, now, like an edit from recent years, this is actually not true. This is not how it went down. Actually, it was very violent, and they killed most of indigenous people. So what you're seeing here as an artifact of Museum of Natural History is a certain frame that is violent, and it's not true. And I found it to be, like, it's almost nothing, you know? Like, it's not a lot to give to people, but at the very least, there are so many people who go through that museum, who come from all over the world, and who walk through this and see that. And to put it there already for me was at least like some sort of acknowledgement that was nice to see.
Can I briefly comment? I think Oksana's question was like if indigenous groups inside of the US, they were showing more solidarity with Ukrainians, colonized peoples of Russia than like white people in the US doing this. And I would comment from what I saw in like Europe, for example, when coming to like a leftist circle, which would involve German activists and, for example, Kurdish Palestinian activists. I think it's a lot about access to information also, because I think for people who are not privileged to have access to so much, I don't know, education or time to read stuff, like in many cases it's also people of color, people from different indigenous communities, so I think many of them do not position themselves because they didn't have access to this kind of information, I think, and to this kind of discussions so much, so I think they would maybe position if this would be more present in general. But we had this with Kurdish activists that they were really like into, I don't know, NATO and Putin thing, because I think they just did not read enough, and I don't know, we are discussing with them now here in Berlin, for example, things, and I think it might change if they just have more information. But I would assume that there are maybe individual indigenous scholars in both Canada and the US who know the same amount of information, and they maybe position themselves, but it's not applying to maybe grassroots indigenous communities who in general don't really participate so much. And I think this kind of talking, which is happening in, I don't know, semi-academic or political groups.
Yeah, and also, but I would say there is a more potential for that education when it comes to solidarity with indigenous groups of Russia than, for example, I would say Palestine, because calling out Israel, boycotting Israel is illegal in the States. It's illegal in like most of the states of America, so it's so institutionalized and it's so normalized to not extend solidarity to Palestinians, to disregard their experience, that to educate people on that, you really have to seek out the resources. You really have to deliver it to people, like to like show up on their doorstep and be like, this is it. And I think with, hopefully, when it comes to Russian imperialism, because the US is positioned so much against Russia, maybe it is a momentum that like could be built upon and to be like invited into those spaces. But I would definitely say, yeah, it depends on the person, because also when so many people are focused on surviving, it's hard to like divert their attention to something else. All of this is not in the media, like in like, I don't know, like NBC News, CNN News, Fox News, none of them talk about it. So like an average person would not necessarily know that. But then, yeah, there are like a lot of scholars, indigenous scholars, who are finally having more access to academic institutions, but not at all a lot of access. Most of them cannot get tenured position, they cannot get job security to be able to stand there and say, I'm gonna talk about all of this, I'm gonna engage with this, and like I will not be like fired or like receive some sort of backlash. So I think, yeah, it's a very complicated matter in this sense.
And also the comment to what you mentioned about black people traveling to the USSR and then positively commenting on it, there is also a collective, Lesa Pagurich and Tatiana Shukwa, like Belarusian and Ukrainian researchers. They did like a number of things in the US and universities where they were discussing the legacy of Audre Lorde when Audre Lorde was actually criticizing racism in the Soviet Union, and then trying to like have this like circles with black scholars who study legacy of Robeson and other people traveling to the USSR and trying to like deconstruct it. So this is a process, but I think it's a very small circle in comparison to the bigger academia, so it's maybe not visible from outside if you are not interacting with them directly or something like this.
We love Audre Lorde.
And that was their comment, and then I can also give to someone else.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation, and also I'm going to share my own experience with Western left and also a question at the end. So I'm from Iran, I'm in exile here. I kind of go back, and my engagement with the Western left started like around 10 years ago about Syria. This is when I realized, actually about Iran also, like when I came out I saw all these Western leftists supporting the regime that is like killing my friends, and I have friends in prison in Iran. So this was my first confrontation with them. And actually coming back to Syria, and I want to actually refer to your question also. A couple of years ago, the Hawaii Teachers Union made a statement. I don't know if you know Tulsi Gabbard. Do you know Tulsi Gabbard? She was a Democrat and that was super pro-Assad and pro-Putin. She even traveled to Syria to meet Assad. and I think she traveled to Moscow also, and she wanted to run as the local Democratic candidate of Hawaii, and I was very surprised that the Hawaii Teachers Union, which is the biggest union apparently in Hawaii, made a statement and rejected her candidacy based on the fact that she supports Assad, and she was specifically based on the fact that she was denying chemical attack that Assad did on Syrians. So it was atrocity denialism that kind of created this kind of solidarity from Hawaii. Like, I mean, I would not have expected anything like this from leftists or socialists in the West, but because they're indigenous people in the West, in the US, experiencing genocide denialism themselves, they made a statement and called her out and rejected her. So this is maybe one of the groups that you can reach out to, and maybe they have an understanding. And a question I wanted to ask is, how do you see similarities or differences between Russian idea of whiteness and white supremacy and European idea of whiteness and white supremacy? Are they in conflict? Do they complete each other? How, or has it changed throughout years? Because I think it would help us also in the concept of Germany, which, as you raised it, there's no word for white supremacy in Germany. And you cannot call people racist publicly. They can take you to court for defamation, which has happened to my friends. Like, they called someone racist and the person took them to court. So I think whiteness is something that kind of gives us an opportunity to connect our struggles. And I want to know, how do you see Russian whiteness?
Thank you for sharing your experiences and for your questions. I would definitely say that Hawaii is like very progressive and they're great. I've read a lot of like their abolitionist work, and like they have a lot of ideas about decolonization, and they also are engaging so hardly with the tourism industry that has been extremely detrimental to the island, and also like with like American billionaires. So it's like a whole different thing, and it's so kind of them to still like they're going through much and still extend that solidarity. In my own personal experience, so I've lived in Moscow for a year, then I lived in Budapest in Hungary for a couple of years, in Spain for a little, and then now I live in the US. So I've experienced white supremacy all over the place. I have never experienced it as violently and as badly as I did in Moscow. I would say it comes from the fact that I am Central Asian, I look Central Asian. To them, like I always, when I explain it to my American friends, they say, oh, like we're like you're Mexicans or whatever. Like they hate us, we do like cheap labor. So it was like extremely violent, but it was in a very different term, in a sense that like growing up in Kazakhstan, we never really talked about race. We learned, I think, like in 5th grade or something, that race has like biological roots. So they're like, basically, I think we learned that they're like black race, white race, yellow race, or like Mongoloid race. Like these are like this thing that's like from biology, that's it, like case closed. And then we never go back to it. And we never talk about like, well, we don't learn about Russian imperialism in general in Kazakhstan. We talk about how Kazakh Khanates voluntarily joined Russia in the 17th century. And because of that, because we don't have education about that, when we come like face to face with white supremacy in Russia, it seems like it's targeted specifically against, I would say, like socioeconomic position of Kazakhs and Central Asians. Like, it's a great way to conceal white supremacy and to conceal the discourses about race, and also take away, like you said, like from people the tools for recognizing what's going on and the tools for like maybe like dealing with that. I would say that because Russia does not employ, has not employed the discourse about race when it came to Kazakhstan and Central Asia, here I'm talking about my own experience just so I am more accurate. It has been easier for them to deny that they engaged in the same level of atrocities as, for example, the US did with slavery, as when they did with Jim Crow laws, with segregation, lynching. For them, they're like, oh, like look at this, like savage American people doing all of that. Well, we're so very kind. We have the friendship of the people, which was a common narrative in the Soviet Union, that everyone is friends with each other and everyone is just engaging in its common motherland. So I think it's a different expression of white supremacy when it's focused more on like homogenizing people, whereas in the US, for example, it focused more on segregation and it focused more on like penalizing anyone who speaks out against it. And because like during the USSR, like technically we had a Kazakh SSR, so like it was technically a separate like republic. And now in Russia they call them autonomous republics, so they give them an illusion of some sort of freedom and autonomy, so it's like harder, I guess, to complain. But I would say that the idea of that it is a civilizing mission. It is an idea that those people are savages. They don't know, like Kazakhs, my ancestors, they were nomads. So by the time Russians came, they did not have agriculture. They did not really like plow the land, especially in the north. And this was a very common narrative of Western Central, like of in Russia, in like I don't know, like Eurocentric world, the Enlightenment world, if that the land is not being used for agriculture, then those people don't know how to use it, and they don't deserve that land, and the land is virgin, and we're gonna take it. And the same thing happened with indigenous lands in the US, and I feel like the narratives of civilizing people who don't know how to use their land, who don't know how to act properly, who don't know how to, I don't know, like, there have been a lot of ideas about Central Asians that like maybe it's a bit crude, but there is like a certain stereotype that like some Russians comment on like social media saying that Central Asians did not even know how to go to the toilet before Russians came and showed it to us. Yeah, so I think, yeah, the idea of like the white savior is predominantly the same. The idea that anything that does not resemble this like specific Eurocentric idea of like settling, building cities, engaging with the land in a very extractive manner, taking from the land, building buildings, whatever, like engaging in the catching up for the like capitalist idea of success, all of it is very much present across different empires and across like Russian white supremacy or American white supremacy. The way they go about it and the way they conceal it and the way they normalize it is very different though. So, but it's a very, I'm sorry if it's not like enough, it's a very like a huge, this could be an entirely different conversation, but yeah.
If I have a right to add like a little thing from like a white person from Russia, Russia is trying to use these narratives and it's actively positioning itself. For example, in Black Lives Matter discussion, we had Russian liberals writing stuff and it was translated. And also Putin is saying something which is very close to what Russian liberals are saying, where they directly connect whiteness in the West and whiteness in Russia. And Russia is being this like actor who is bringing the true whiteness back, because this whiteness has been erased because of so many people of color migrating, and then gay people are here and everything, and Russia is like, this is the true whiteness. I think they really built this. It's maybe also a concept from top down. I have it direct.
I just want to say something quickly on Hawaii, because you said, like, I remember in the 70s or 80s there was an interview with an anti-colonial Hawaiian sort of resistance activist, and I wish I could remember her name, I will look it up, but she expressed solidarity with Czechoslovaks under Soviet military occupation, which is what I was born under. And until today, I'm just like absolutely in awe and gratitude to her, because I did not expect, you know, something like that being understood from Hawaii, and something must be happening in that place because people get it.
You have a question, or?
Yeah, I want to add just about the white supremacy in Russia. I think we should not ignore also that there was racial domination over a century and still going on, and that apart from like this friendship of nations, whatever, liberation of women, there was also like facts that, for example, native people couldn't live in cities, and only Russians could live in cities, you know, and also like that we still till this day have a slur, each of us different. My ethnicity, Tajik, is even a slur by itself for Russians, like, you know, so I think we should not also ignore these parts of racial domination, because it still took place and it's taking place to this day. So I think we can openly speak of Russian Empire as a white supremacist empire, and ignore, on the contrary, like the part of the friendship of nations, because that was a myth and the construct, and in the reality it still is a white supremacist empire.
Yeah, I thank you, and I definitely agree, because I think the narrative of friendship of the people has been very instrumental in, like the whole like weaponization of indigenous communities and land. Because if it's a friendship, why won't you help out your friend by giving them your land, by going to them for war, by giving, by being okay with constructing like nuclear sites, by going through, I don't know, like giving some of the resources, etc. So yeah, like this idea that everyone is benevolent and everyone's engaged in them on their own volition, and then just taking away from people, but giving them some sort of representation and recognition by saying it's a friendship of very different people. And I think it's maybe similar to the way we have right now, like often representation, for example, of the LGBTQ communities in the West, which comes with representation but does not come necessarily with trans rights or with like inclusion in like the various level of institutions, etc. So, and I also, going back to what you said about, I think like Russian white supremacy is heavily rooted in the fact that the West has been catering too much to diversity. They have been catering too much to feminists, to LGBTQ community, to black people, people of color, and they have lost their sight of what's important and how to rule over people so everyone remains in line and we can all reach that modernity together under strict conditions. And Putin would like to remind them how to do it. Which is like a very important aspect of it. Dinar had a question. I don't know if you still have it.
I think it's long gone, but maybe I just comment that it's really interesting, like during Soviet times, how they also managed culture and national expression in culture. And I think, I might be wrong, but I think it was Khrushchev who said like, we should have it national in form, but socialist in content, which is another way of like erasing national identities. Because certain things were permitted, let's say we have buildings, Soviet buildings with national ornament, which is kind of a representation of how it went, or like extent to which cultures could still live on. But then whatever went against socialism or like Soviet propaganda, that would immediately ban them, like religion, language, whatever the types of traditional knowledge and rituals, and and I also, I remember my question. I was thinking that while we're talking about how academia is still not possible to decolonize to an extent, and then also how badly does it do its job to make space for representing people. I was thinking, what are the alternative ways of making knowledge? Maybe what are the ways you engaged in making this non-academic knowledge, or making space for these discussions? Since maybe it's also good not to rely on academia so much, and media as well, which is just kind of centrist or conservative in most places. So I myself don't know how to approach that, but it would be good to hear.
Thank you. A very good question. So in my personal experience, what I've tried to do is that I try to bypass maybe academic publications. Well, first of all, a great example of sharing knowledge is what we're doing right here today. And I think it's way more inspiring than any like academic conference that you would have. I think it's important so in academia, publications are very important. The more you publish, the more you're cited, the more basically clout you have, like the more you will be like recognized. And I think a good way to go around it that I found is to publish in grassroots movements and grassroots organizations. For example, I wrote recently a paper explaining reactions to Russian migrants in Kazakhstan. And I decided not to publish it in an academic journal. I'm going to publish it with the South-South movement that has started in the CEU in Budapest and now in Vienna. Those are like scholars of color who are publishing something themselves. They also do a lot of education. They do a lot of Zoom lectures and stuff like that. It's going to be published for everyone to see. So I think it's like good to find like those like little like spaces that are like doing this type of education and like publishing it for free for everyone to see. Another thing I found is that whenever like if I publish something that's like an academic journal, it's like a 20-page research. Is what I've done is that I've wrote a shorter opinion article that's like 2 pages long, where I explain it, the gist of it, and like the main arguments of it, and I publish it in an open source, like a grassroots like publication, so it's like more accessible to people. And then I also translate it into like Kazakh and Russian, so it's not only in English. So I think there are ways to do it. It definitely requires an extra effort, and a lot of people are like tired and not paid enough and burn out to do that sometimes, but there are a lot of people who engage with it that you can find, and you can like ask them to like edit your stuff, like publish your stuff, and I think, I mean, if we could, maybe we should start like a resource page where you can go to find that type of education. Maybe I'm gonna write it down, maybe I should do it. Thank you.
Here, and then I give to you.
Hello.
Hi.
I think it's important to listen to minority voices, but one should not expect immediately some kind of wisdom from that, because, for example, Russians in Baltics are also minorities who are facing discrimination. But many average Russians use this kind of Russian greatness just to live their self-centered lives and not care about their community transformations. I went to Estonia for Christmas and didn't have enough money for plane tickets, so I took a ride with a Russian transwoman who is working here, and she is actually an educated person. She has a master's degree in engineering and earning much more than me. But she also uses words like pederast and kohol, and thinks that the Soviet Union fell apart because Russia took too much care of small nations.
Oh, wow.
So those kind of persons also exist. Another thing is that I don't have any personal connection with academia. I just follow people on Twitter, and I think like many scholars from ex-Soviet Union are doing great work. But I think this question is wrong. Or do they see us? We should ask, do we see each other? Because from liberals to Stalinists in Eastern Europe, they mainly want to be part of this Western left. And this is why it's so uncomfortable when you're not neglected. And I think there's not enough community building. And I've seen like in Estonia, it's actually even got worse. Like this grassroots, like when people get older, they want to be part of the establishment, they want to be part of the middle class, and less and less kind of free spaces.
Thank you. I see that people are starting to leave. Can I ask if I can take a picture of all of you for my own personal archive, if it's okay? It's going to be from I'm going to take it from this chair. I hope I can fit everyone. Oh yeah, everyone almost fits.
And we would take 1 to 3 comments here, and I don't know what the.
Okay, I'm gonna give
and then we have to end, and then informally continue.
Okay, I'm gonna give you a 1, 2, 3 warning. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Yay! Thank you. Okay, sorry.
Okay, so I have a question. So on your first slide, you have this concept of we should call people in instead of calling them out. And I thought, oh fuck, I always call people out. And so
I also do that.
Share, my experience, I have been very politically active to support Ukraine. I have Ukrainian roots myself. I have family and friends in Ukraine. And so before I go to a protest, especially like in the feminist scene kind of stuff, I always check out the political groups who are there. And so I found this group called Young Struggle, and I checked their social media, and I just wanted to see what is their political agenda basically. And first of all, I was kind of shocked by their silence about Ukraine. But then I found two takes basically, so 2 things they had to say about the invasion and Russian imperialism. And so one thing was that they called out anti-Russian violence. And I'm so confused by that because basically my Ukrainian friends went back to Ukraine because they were harassed and attacked by people in Germany so much who I don't even know if they don't even have Russian passports. They just somehow believe in Russian propaganda. So this was the first thing. So they totally ignore the fact that a lot of Ukrainians are dying, that indigenous Russians are dying, and they have this. Yeah, so they were very worried about anti-Russian violence. And the second thing, which, this is actually what shocked me so much, is that they said, I don't know if you've heard about it, but the German government decided last year to make some effort to I don't really know how to say it, to say Holodomor is a genocide. So this is what happened last year because of the invasion of Ukraine. That's kind of weird that this is, the catalyzer for it. And this group said that Holodomor is anti-communist propaganda.
Oh.
And so, oh my God, I'm so angry about it still now. And and in this post they said this so-called Soviet Empire under Stalin, so they completely deny Soviet and Russian imperialism, and they basically said that this genocide did not happen. And I'm pretty sure they have never thought about other genocides that happened in the Soviet Union. And I don't even know how these people think they're leftists. I really don't know how you can just deny a genocide and think you're leftist. And still, I think calling people in is so much better than calling people out, because this just makes me angry, and I'm so, I lose all my energy. But I really don't know how to call these self-proclaimed Western communists in, so.
I mean, it sounds like they don't want to be called in, but I understand. But the thing about calling people in is that you cannot force them in. You can call them in, and if they want, they can come in. But I think what we can do is offer resources, make resources public, make platforms public, like just amplify voices. So it's like more like maybe in their face, like they come face to face with it more. It's becoming like more normalized to think this way in their like around them. So they start questioning like, oh, like I'm so hard bent on this, but then I hear so many other things, so maybe I should reconsider. But it's impossible to force anyone into it, unfortunately, and you can only educate someone if they want to be educated. So.
I think these people are educated on Holodomor because they know the resources, they have read about it. They just say that it did not happen, and that this is saying that it happened is anti-communist propaganda, you know. So I really don't know. I don't know, and this is just so violent. Yeah.
Wow.
Oh, sorry.
Question. So the point about the Služba naroda and Soviet Union is anti-colonial, which is basically, it was anti-colonial in discourses, but totally colonial in its actions. But have you faced situations when people are so stick to this identity, so Soviet propaganda was real, and they are not even challenging their position, like, as you mentioned, decolonization is messy, it's painful, and it's actually accepting that we were colonized and we were a victim of this process. It takes a lot of effort. Like, do you have any positive examples of reaching out to these people and saying, hey, we already, we had this experience, the earlier you kind of wake up and the earlier you accept it, the easier it will be when you work the processes. For example, when we're saying that ethnic minorities in Russia, who are saying that, hey, but we are Russians, or hey, we're Soviets, and everything is great, and everything is going to be great. It is always easier to count yourself as a part of a bigger group, which has quite history than saying that we were oppressed. Sorry, it was a bit messy, but I hope you understand.
No, yeah, I got it. I'm blanking right now. I think it's, I've had conversations with younger people, and it's easier with them. My grandma, she passed away before the war, but she was a Soviet person. She would see a napkin on the street, and she would be in Soviet Union, never. Look at this, the mess that capitalism has become, and I'm just what? So it's, and I honestly don't know how I would try to re-educate her, because I have people, I have friends whose grandparents and parents are against it, and then or they really think of themselves as Soviet people, they believe in Soviet communism, and I think it takes a lot of patience, but also sometimes you have to be a bit hard on them. Sometimes I excommunicate them for a while, so I'm you're so wrong, I cannot even talk to you right now, and then I go back to them and I'm did you change your mind? Can we talk? Yeah. I mean, it's no one is a saint with endless patience to always be welcoming and always debate people, always try to engage with people. Sometimes you need to have your own space, and also decolonizing involves a lot of self-care, not in a commodified capitalist sense of self-care, but self-care in terms of saving your own spirit and saving your own energy for something that is more productive and useful. And so sometimes if we cannot do that, that's very understandable. I don't know, I just offer a lot of resources. I try to offer some books. I try to find what they're interested in. If they're interested, if they work in a specific field, maybe there is an article that talks about how that field suffered from Russian imperialism, Soviet colonization. So I try to make it relevant to them. And maybe when they talk about Soviet Union and they say oh, this was great, I try to say well, actually maybe this was great for you in this position, but actually the same thing happened somewhere else and it was a very different thing. May not work if a person, like I said, doesn't want to. It's hard, but yeah, it's you just have to keep trying, I guess. I don't know.
Sorry, may I just a quick extension to my question? Also, I think the matter of this language dominance bring us to the situation when ethnic Kazakh speaking Kazakh became marginalized in Kazakhstan, and if you reflect now, southern Kazakhstan was the most decolonized in sense, but nobody was engaging with them, nobody was speaking with them because they were the only ones who were speaking Kazakh, apparently. So it was also a nice discovery for myself, so I just wanted to share with the audience how it was, so many things were just unquestioned because of this cultural domination.
Yeah, and that's the good thing about all of it is that, a good thing, I don't know. is that we are having so many conversations in Kazakhstan. We are questioning, like, there used to be a word that, like, you would call people who are, like, more savage and less cultured, who don't speak Russian or whatever, and it now became a slur. You cannot say it now. If you say it, people will call you out, and it's only happened in the last, like, 2 or 3 years, and it's definitely a progress. And I think as that changes, it helps to kind of shift people's minds. Like, my dad, he, the son of that grandma who was a Soviet person, he grew up and he saw that his whole life that he was going to serve the Communist Party. This was his life trajectory, his life career. Then the Soviet Union fell apart and everything. And then recently he texted in the group chat and he was like, oh, if it's okay with you, I'm going to start texting in Kazakh here. I will make mistakes, but I'm just going to, like, try to speak more Kazakh. And then he just engages a lot with the topic. And from someone who was about to dedicate their whole life to Soviet, like, communism and Soviet authorities, to start thinking that, like, he should speak Kazakh, that he, like, should do, like, some, like, own decolonization. It's a huge progress, and I think it would not happen if he did not see that around himself, and if there wasn't so much, like, perspective being put in his face by various people, including me and my brother. So, like, it takes time, but sometimes it works.
Yeah. So, to comments.
So, I wanted to thank you for the presentation and bringing to the fore many, uncanny feelings I was experiencing with Western leftists for quite a while now. My background is from Bosnia and also affected by the genocide in Srebrenica directly, and from my experience I see many parallels with Western leftist engagement with Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and also regarding their engagement with indigenous communities either within Russia or in Central Asia or basically anywhere. And so what I was wondering is how Islamophobia is tying into that disengagement with indigenous communities, because for many Western leftists, religion is a concept which does not resonate with them at all, and they reject spirituality, and many of the so-called underdog communities are spiritually connected to their lands. They follow some kind of religion, and does that also diminish the possibility for those Western leftists to support their cause?
Yeah. Religion is definitely a huge factor. I do have to say that a lot of indigenous groups in Russia, they're not necessarily Muslim. A lot of them are Buddhist, a lot of them are Christian, some of them are Muslim. So it's not, you cannot say that it's specifically just Islamophobia that plays a factor. It is definitely the conversion into Euro Christian values, specific idea of Christianity that is propagated by Russian imperialism. But when it comes to Western left and Islamophobia, it's a huge deal. I have I used to follow this leftist Western account on Instagram, and I was a fan of their work and whatever. And then they started posting how they don't believe that the concentration camps in China that hold Uyghur and Kazakh people are concentration camps. They were saying their education is necessary. They were saying if people are religious, then it's only valid that we re-educate them. And then they were people are so afraid when we make someone sit down and read a book, which is basically what China is doing. They're making them sit down and read a book so they can stop being so Muslim. And it was appalling because this is the person who was so engaged in so many other things. So I think in this sense, Islamophobia is a very real and central piece to that. It is very central to disengagement with Palestine and the idea that Palestinians do not deserve freedom and liberation because they're so backward, because we have the idea that if you allow people to be Muslim, they're gonna end up like the Taliban or ISIS or whatever. And in this sense, it's been very, for me, someone who had a complicated relationship with Islam growing up in Kazakhstan and felt like there wasn't a space in Islam for someone like me, it was extremely gratifying to find so many activists and artists and writers who are Muslim, who write about being queer and Muslim, being like, I don't know, like, like being a leftist and Muslim. Like, there's a great book that came out last year. It's called Islam and Anarchism by Mohammed Abdu, who's this Egyptian scholar who, like, it's basically an abolitionism book that targets capitalism and white supremacy, and it's done beautifully. That showcases like why Islam is not necessarily an evil thing that Western leftists pointed out to be. But yeah, like when it came to Central Asia, Islam was a key factor in justifying the empowerment of like Soviet women, the burning of madrasas, the forceful unveiling of women. It was very central to the idea that being Muslim is equal to not being free, it's equal to being backward. I cannot really speak about how it's constructed today, just because currently Russian imperialism functions after years of Soviet propaganda that was focused on eradicating religion from the conversation, and then also because so many indigenous communities are Buddhist, Christian, and Muslim. So I would not say that like it would have to be a very specific, when we talk about specific groups, when we talk about specific settings, to say how Islamophobia plays a role in that. But overall, yeah, just because Russian Empire was right next to Central Asia that became Muslim, they always took it as a central part of its modernizing project.
But also from the 90s, North Caucasus is like place to look at, because that's where the connection is built with Islamophobia in the US, and people leave North Caucasus and go to ISIS now, and there is this movement of people between like Syria and US imperialism and Russia now working closely together to also amplify Islamophobia, I would say, globally. So it's a big topic which is very diverse everywhere. And last question.
Thank you.
Hi.
I just wanted to also look back. For example, in Kazakhstan, the topic of decolonialism is, I think now, is very present, and it's not only present within this closed academic environment, but also is present within the media, within pop culture, podcasts, music, like independent indie movies coming out, touching on decolonialism either directly or somehow portraying it as well. But how do you see these platforms happening within the autonomous, like Bashkortostan or Tatarstan, where this big Russian brother is still looking over, and this platform cannot be created as easily as it is for us, I think? And how do you personally see it happening there?
Well, thank you, and it's a very tough question. I don't think I necessarily have an answer of like how I'm seeing it's happening. A note on decolonization in Kazakhstan is that yes, it's happening intensely and it's unprecedented, but at the same time, it's becoming more complicated because the discourse on decolonization can sometimes be co-opted by nationalism and by traditionalism and conservatism, as like going back to pre-colonial time, which includes a lot of violence against women, like a very like patriarchal gender roles, exclusion of the LGBTQ community. So what I'm worried about now in Kazakhstan is that the discourse on decolonization can exclude all of those people, or even ethnic minorities in Kazakhstan, such as Uyghurs and Dungans, because it has the capacity to turn into something else. So I think we should monitor it very closely and always like engage with it just to like prevent it in some way. I think that the way to like, I've seen people engaged in decolonization in like autonomous republics of Russia is that, well, it's very, very dangerous for them, and yet they do it anyway. I think it helps a lot that a lot of them have diasporas outside, and they produce like so much like knowledge and things outside of the country that can like travel like back to it through the internet, but then also we have the problem that people who are outside of Russia experience and see things differently than those who stayed, and those who have like a different perspective, or maybe seeing things that are like you cannot see from outside. So maybe it creates a certain like divergence of like decolonial discourses. But I've seen like a lot of interviews with people. I've seen people post a lot on like specifically like on social media. I think it has been instrumental and like disseminating decolonial discourses from those regions. I don't know like where it's going now and whether or not it would be able to reach the same level like as it has in Kazakhstan. For example, we had a book that came out on decolonization of Kazakhstan. It's the first book on the topic that has been sold in major like bookstore chains. I don't see it happening anytime soon, out there, but I don't even think maybe it is necessary in a way that like, I think of ways of decolonizing and ways of organizing don't have to all look necessarily the same, or they don't necessarily have to have this like formal institutionalized manner. If they are still very underground, they could still find their own supporters and ways to mobilize, hopefully. So we can see. Thank you.